Good evening. Welcome to the vBrownBag. Tonight we're talking about leveraging observability and AI in software development with Matthew Bonig. Sorry, I had muted y'all's mics for the intro. So there we go. You know what? Let's do it this way. Yes. Perfect. Matthew, did I say your last name right?
You close enough. It's technically Bonig, but I'm never going to hold it against anybody for getting it wrong.
You know what? That's on me, though. I actually try to do a really good job of making sure that I get folks' names correct, right?
Well, you did a good job.
I used to call Roger, and he hated it. So
yeah, we had to squash that one quick.
Yeah, I was like, enough with the Roger, man. Yeah. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to throw this slide back up on the screen real quick because what I would like to point out to you before we get going, if you like our content, like and subscribe on YouTube. It always helps us out. You can join us online. Of course, we have our YouTube channel, which is at vBrownBag. We're also on Threads and Twitch and LinkedIn. I said Threads. I didn't mean Threads. I meant Blue Sky. Our Blue Sky is at vBrownBag.com. I'm Damien. My co-host this evening is Mr. Roger. And yeah, Chris is traveling for work, and Shala is probably staying at home and still working. So there we have it. That's our lineup for tonight. So how are you guys doing?
Good. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Roger, you haven't been on here in a while. It's good to see your face.
Thank you.
Is there anything fun and exciting you've been up to?
Nothing. Just coaching basketball, right?
Oh, that's fun and exciting.
With some kids. So it was a good time, helping out.
Yeah. How's the team doing?
Well, they won gold over the weekend at the tournament. So I want to say that it went really well.
What's the age group?
16, 17-year-olds.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So they're playing real basketball at that point.
Well, relatively. It's still fun to watch, though. It's pretty good.
Gotcha.
A few years ago, my two oldest boys, it's more than a few years ago, but they were going to this kind of small charter school, and they had a basketball team that was lined up against the other charter schools in the area. And their charter school was pretty homogenous in terms of the students that attended. And by that, I mean they were all white and none of them grew up playing basketball. And so I ended up going to this game where they were playing this other charter school. And you could tell that every single one of those children had been playing ball their entire lives. And I think the score was like 98-2 or something. Like they were just clowning on the kids. It was like watching the Globetrotters,
We're making like half-court shots.
Yeah. There's like a trampoline involved. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's awesome that your team is doing very well.
Thanks.
So, Mr. Matthew, please
Yes.
tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a tech nerd, have been pretty much my entire life. I grew up playing video games and playing with computers. When I got out towards the end of high school, I realized that my dream of being a 3D animator required way too much artistic talent for what I had. So I decided to go into more of the computer science and software development world. Didn't like what I learned in college. I thought it sounded really boring, and I had no desire to do the things that they teach in a computer science program in college, which is how to write compilers and how processors work and all that. So I went into IT, and I stayed in computers, but I did more support and implementation type stuff for a few years, and then got back into development towards the end of 2008. Was a .NET developer for about 7 years, working on line of business applications for various customers here in the Denver area. And then decided to shift gears. I was getting really tired of building the same application over and over, which was just some static web form over top of some database record. So I self-taught myself Node.js, Mean Stack, Angular, all that good stuff. And then I went out contracting on my own for a few years, building usually small one-off applications for line of business type stuff still. Did that for a while. And then while I was at Rackspace building an application, 2 weeks before the second major version of that application, which was, again, an internal application, right before it launched, they said, we're going to change our business process, and now we can just use Jira. This was back in the day where Jira was actually smiled upon and people generally liked its functionality. So I got shifted over into doing DevOps, and I learned a lot more about AWS and developer operations. And I really liked it when I first started doing it because I still got to do development work. I still got to program. I just did that for other developers rather than for faceless people who I never got to meet. And now for coming up in April, I'm going to hit 5 years with Defiance Digital. We are an MSP based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Our job and our focus is on helping small businesses and startups run their workloads and their custom applications, which are usually B2C type applications, on AWS. So we act as their AWS experts. We do account management. We usually do a lot of IAC work, pipeline work, things like that. And we just let them focus on building their specific application that they are working on, the actual code behind it. Sort of the delineation is we handle infrastructure, they handle code.
Cool. And a tall person named Chris told me that you wrote a book. Is that true?
Yes. It was not by myself. Me and 3 other people, we wrote a book a few years ago called the CDK book that goes over from front to back the AWS CDK, the Cloud Development Kit, which is used for doing a lot of IAC work in AWS now. So we wrote that book and launched it just before the 2.0 version was released a few years ago, and still, do a lot of work day to day in the CDK, do some talks and still some content for it on a regular basis.
Very cool. Cool. All righty. Did you want to jump right into your talk?
Yeah, I mean, nothing formally prepared, but, as Chris and I were chatting about it, there's been a couple of things that have been sort of on my mind lately in the development world. And one of them is feels very backwards facing, and one of them feels very forwards facing. And I always like to mix up talks and presentations to try to have a little bit of a story on there. So I wanted to look back and kind of review where we are at right now in the industry as far as observability and those sort of foundational concepts within software development. And then also talk about, AI is hot, but we're really starting to see now after 2 years some very, very focused AI products come in. And I'm not talking about OpenAI or Anthropic's models. I'm talking about the products that are being built off of these things. And there was one that just launched last week, which I saw the release of it. I've been talking to the main guy behind it now for quite a while. I worked for him for a few years a while back, and it's just a very, very interesting product. So let's start about observability. When we're talking about software development, and Damien, you have a background in software development, there's this constant battle between feature development to make your business and to make your clients happy, and those foundational technical non-feature, non-customer focusing concerns. So when you think about technical debt is one of those things that just grows and grows and grows over time because it's not a business concern. The business is very rarely convinced that here's a problem that we have to fix. What they're concerned about is here's a client who wants to give me a bunch of money, but they're not going to do it until this feature is added into the product. So all of the efforts go into feature development. And we see that with most of our clients where most, if not all, and I'm talking like 90 to 95% of development work that goes into a product is going into adding features, adding functionality, or fixing bugs. Mm-hmm. But what we have seen now working with these startups and small businesses is that the observability side of their application is almost always lagging behind. The first place that people always start is with logging. And logging to me is sort of interesting. You know, I think we've all built an application before and we start writing a function and we do a console.log or a logger.info or whatever your language of choice, and however you do output to your logging library or your console, you just sort of drop in these things and sprinkle them in your code and you go, well, here's some function that I'm writing and I might care about this value in the future. Or you've got a bug, you know you've got a bug in that code somewhere, and now you add these things in retroactively to try to figure out what's going wrong with it. Yep. And this is always a chasing your tail on this sort of thing. You're never really caught up to it too well when you take this approach to it. And years ago, I worked for a very brilliant engineer and software developer, and he introduced me to the idea of logging as an aspect. And this isn't a new concept by any means. It's been around for decades, but I very rarely see it implemented. So when we were working on a project for a company out of the Miami area, he said, we're never going to write one of those log messages. That's not what we're going to do here. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to add a decorator to all of our classes, all of our method calls. We were doing this as a C# application. We had good dependency injection, so this was very easy to wire up. But what it did was that every single method that was invoked in the system, it would automatically log out that method name, all the inputs to that function, and then when the function returned, it would log all the outputs to it. And first time I saw this, I'm like, oh, this is just going to kill our logging. Like, this is going to blow up. And he goes, no, we can take care of that. Logging systems can handle large volumes. That's not a problem. And I said, okay, whatever. And we hadn't been out in production for more than maybe a few days when we got a report that there was a bug in the system. And immediately it's like, okay, what was the user input? What was happening? All of this. And in 30 seconds, we could go straight to the log, see exactly where the error occurred, could see what the input was to that function. And then we just basically copied and pasted that into a new test, replicated, fixed, and deployed out. And it was incredibly fast. It was incredibly fulfilling to sit there and be like, I'm not having to guess about what the state is of my application or guess about what's going on. And this was long before, common tools like Datadog or New Relic or anything that gave us really application level tracing front to back. This was, a very rudimentary approach, but it was massively important to the success of that application and how we were able to debug things live. And so that's kind of those first things that we talk about our customers a lot with is you've got this application, but you don't really know what's going on when it fails. You have to really guess, and you have to hope that the error logging that you put into place was actually going to tell you everything you needed to know.
Right.
But if you've got a really granular application, if you got these fine-grained functions that aren't 500 lines long, but instead 10, which you should be building your applications like that. I'm a big proponent of solid design philosophies. Then this type of logging can really, really benefit you in the long term. So we push a lot of our customers to that. And then, of course, the second part of it is trying to understand things like how healthy is the application? How healthy is our data and our state and our runtime? So we were working with a customer just the other day, and one of the questions came up of, well, how many active users do you have in a month? And they're talking to us. They go, well, we could probably figure it out by going down to the database and taking a look at the last login date for one of our users or for all of our users and just see how many have last logged in the last month. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really give you a good picture, though. Did that user log in one time in the last month? Did they log in 100 times? How active were they in the system? And this is when we start having those conversations about what are your key performance indicators, your KPIs for your application. How do you determine if new registrations, do you log this stuff in? Don't just query the database level, but log these things as metric over times so you can see where peaks and valleys and all of this are. A lot of times these KPIs can coincide with errors and can give you very robust alerting along the way as well. So, you may have a case where okay, here's an error that's occurred in the system, and we have some logging, so we know that the error has occurred, and we know it occurred at this time. Well, is that a problem though? Does that indicate there's an issue in the system? Was it a transient problem because of some third party? Are all the users experiencing this problem? And when you start tracking some of these KPIs along the way, like, oh, they posted on social media, so we're going to log a metric to say at this date and time, this user posted this thing. Now you can start to build these alarms that really take in multiple things. Were errors occurring? Was user activity high or low at the time? Was CPU on the particular machine in question? Hopefully you're running multiple nodes and a lot of redundancy, but you start to build in these additional things. But when you're taking a look, and a lot of our customers will look at metrics as simply infrastructure metrics. What is our CPU usage? What is our memory usage? But really the power of those systems is when you start adding in your own metrics to them, you create your own namespaces. Now, whether this be AWS CloudWatch or Datadog or New Relic or anything else along the way, or homegrown type of Grafana type system, it's important to build these things in so you can understand, what is my application actually doing at runtime?
Yeah.
And then the holy grail, the one that can be very easy to add in now, thanks to really, really good tooling from Datadog and others, is this application performance monitoring, APM's tracing, live tracing of an application. We came across a situation not too long ago with one of our clients who was really struggling with this application. It was a Django-based application that would fail and throw out these timeout messages into the logs. And it was occurring frequently enough that we had to investigate. We had to find out, why is this happening 3 or 4 times a day? Mm-hmm. And what we discovered is we had turned on just the basic first run pass at Datadog tracing and APM in their system. And what we discovered was there was a very specific API call that was taking 2 minutes to run. And the only reason it took 2 minutes was because the timeout on their HTTP runtime Gunnicorn was set to 2 minutes. So as soon as it ran over 2 minutes, Gunnicorn just killed it. And now that was the end of that. It could have run for 15, and we don't know. Mm-hmm. But when we dug into it, it was so amazing to be able to go in and within 30 seconds go, okay, here's the log telling us the timeout. We can now go to the actual processor. We can take a look and see what were the queries that were taking 2 minutes to run. And then when we click on it, we start to see those flame graphs and those spans of what took so long. And I remember it was so bad that the Datadog interface basically hung for 45 seconds while it was trying to render everything out. And what we found was this particular API call, it was a Django management API call, was trying to render somewhere in the order of 6,000 of these little HTML widgets. And that was just bogging down the system horribly because it wasn't really handling paging well. It wasn't handling these things. They were using just sort of the out-of-the-box admin functionality, and it just wasn't performant for them. So, these were 3 different cases, but these situations where we put in this observability into place, and when problems occurred, we were able to identify and usually resolve those problems very, very fast, versus some of our customers who don't have any of these tools in place, where they can be down for an hour or two, where they just experiment with what they think is going wrong. And that is incredibly a scary place to be, especially when you are building a new application, you're a startup or a small business, and staying up and running, being able to have those user interactions and keeping those users sticky is really, really important.
Yeah. Yes. I'm just kind of thinking a little bit about what you said.
I said a lot in there. I rambled.
No, that was good. That was good. So I actually had an issue with some of my code last week. That was totally self-inflicted. I gave it some input that I never accounted for it being able to handle. And the specific way that it crapped out left me in a spot that it was very difficult for me to even try to reproduce, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I've got to go and I've got to create this service over here and authenticate over there. And so how does observability help you kind of in testing those environments, right? Because you're talking about being able to point to like where it's breaking, but like in terms of like reproducing and testing that fix.
Yeah, hopefully a lot of it depends on good code structure.
Yeah.
If you've got a function that has 500 lines of code in it, it's doing all of this extra work and it's not delegating to anything else, and you just have these incredibly complex processes. Think of like old school stored procedures where they're just 2,000 lines of code that nobody can read or maintain after the person's gone. Mm-hmm. When you've got that good, I mentioned before, the solid design principles, single responsibility is a big part of that. So boil your functions, boil your methods down into these very, very small bits of compute. And if you do have good logging about what the inputs are to them and what the outputs are to them, reproducing them, any sort of problem is typically very quick and easy to do. And as you know, if you can reproduce a problem locally on your machine and throw a debugger on there, which you can do locally in most situations, you can solve that problem usually very, very quickly. If we could put debuggers into production applications easily, we probably wouldn't even need some of these tools. We wouldn't need these things, but we can't put debuggers into prod environments. So we need to have these tools that replicate a lot of what debugging gives us, like telling us state. And good aspect-oriented logging goes a long way in that process.
Very cool. Roger, I saw you smile when he mentioned logs. And you're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, no, I just remember the back in the days when, you had to go through the logs and sift through, sit there and just go sifting through logs just to find an error, and to see where we are now, with being able to just find things relatively quickly and, solve problems. It's really cool to be able to be in that scenario. But I almost feel like everybody should have to do that at least once, go through logs, manually, right? Right. Learn your lesson, right?
Yeah.
But it just brought me back, created some nostalgia for a moment. But I wouldn't want to do that now.
Yeah. No, I when I do have to go digging through logs in a very opaque way, it's incredibly painful. I'm thankful for the logging tools we have now. It's one of the few things that I think we've actually we're in a pretty nice place right now from a developer experience standpoint when it comes to some of these tools and how easy it is to typically work them into situations. And one of the things that is tough to sell sometimes is these are foundational problems. These are aspects to software development that not only are critical to the long life of a project, but are things that you have to maintain, and aren't just things that you write once and then you walk away from. These are things that you have to spend considerable effort on over the life of an entire project. You have to always be working to make them better. You have to make them more performant. You have to make them clearer in the logging and add tags and custom spans and APMs and things like that. If you don't, what you end up with is the analogy I usually give is a small business starts off and they have 5 employees. So they go out to find an office building, and they find this office building that's perfect for their 5 employees. And everything works well for about a year. Yeah. And then the company grows, and they get more employees, and they go, well, we've already invested all this time and money into this building. We've got a lease for a few more years. Maybe we can just expand. Maybe we can just put another level on top of it. So engineers come in and they put another level on top of it. And that's fine, and things go forward. But you can't keep doing this. The foundation for a 1-story building is not the same foundation for a 10-story building. And if you aren't working on that foundation and rebuilding it and strengthening it over time, you're going to get to that 10-story building and the whole thing is just going to collapse on you. And then you're starting over from scratch. And that's why we so often see a lot of like internal line of business applications and things that just after, say, 5 years, the development team goes, there's nothing we can do about this. It's bad. We know it's bad. It's unperformant. But the only thing we can do at this point is scrap it and start over from scratch. And it doesn't have to be that way, in my opinion. I think there are better ways for handling it. So put that effort into those foundational aspects to the application, and observability is a huge piece of that. I'd say at least a third to a half of what you're doing should be on these observability concerns.
Your building analogy actually reminded me of a cult leader who's building Collapse because they kept adding floors and didn't account for the foundation. Random fact about a cult leader that I know because of the podcast I listen to. So,
this is all over. Can you send me this podcast? I'm curious.
That sounds like an after.
Yeah, well, I was just like, this sounds exactly like that story. So I didn't know if it was modeled on that or something, but it makes perfect sense, and it's a really good analogy. So is this something that you now incorporate into your software development process from the beginning?
Yeah, and you kind of have to. If you don't, what ends up happening, and I'm sure anyone who's ever developed an application listening to this has seen it before. They build it, they do it, everything is ready to go. They deploy it out into either a QA environment or the production environment, and almost immediately someone comes back and goes, "It's not working." Mm-hmm. Besides that being the most useless statement in all of software development, it's not working. Well,
right.
Give me a little bit more, please. Give me a screenshot or something. That doesn't mean much. But if you don't have that observability in place, now all of a sudden you're going back and trying to retrofit it. And now you're under a time crunch to do it. Mm-hmm. It's but we promised this feature by the end of the week. So I'm going to do the cheap, easy solution and incur some technical debt that it's likely to never be paid off in the future.
Yeah.
And
do you have any... Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, you go, Roger.
I almost forgot my question. So, from the, what is the impact, I guess, to observability in complex environments?
Impact to which aspect of it? Runtime performance, developer velocity?
Yeah. So you've got more microservices that that are being presented to organizations, and then of course some companies do worry about performance impact, right? But
sure,
how does that help or hurt, or I guess what are the trade-offs for that towards some of those applications?
Yeah, so a lot of times when it comes to things like verbose logging, the biggest trade-off you have to make is potentially cost, in that if you're logging millions of messages a day, it's going to cost you a bit more than if you're logging a couple of thousand. But the plus side of it is that if something goes wrong, the chances of you fixing it quickly and getting the system back up into revenue generation is probably a lot quicker. And 9 times out of 10 is probably going to be worth that extra upfront cost on the logging. When it comes to performance tracing and things, there are usually some small performance hits that comes with it. It depends on what system you're using. Some are better than others. If you were going to roll your own, then that's something you're going to own as far as how much of a performance hit it takes. And if you build it wrong, you could certainly have some slowdown in your application. Generally speaking, the stuff that I've been doing a lot lately is around Lambda functions, and we use Datadog both at Defiance Digital, and most of our clients are using it as well. And I haven't noticed any significant performance difference when getting it in place. Maybe a little bit to some cold start times, but the value that we get out of it by being able to see how events occurred in Lambda and even propagated to other services like SQS and the Lambdas that listen to those SQS queues is invaluable. And in a lot of those cases, maybe a 5% performance, it's worth it to be able to have that visibility.
Is that just added as another layer on your function?
Yeah, so the way that they do it, and I'm of course using CDK constructs to handle a lot of this, is that there is an additional layer that gets added that introduces the runtime components, and then they effectively wrap the your original handler with their little custom instrumentation handler.
Cool. I'm gonna have to check that out.
It's really slick. When I first saw it a couple weeks ago, I was blown away because the first thing I looked at was like, okay, well, here's my Lambda, here's my cold start time on it, here's the execution time, and then here's this big bar that says SQS, and then here's another Lambda invocation and the cold start and all that. And it took me a few seconds to realize what I was seeing was that one particular message, how it propagated from the original Lambda writing to an SQ being in that queue for a couple of seconds before the other Lambda picked it up and processed it. And I could see the flame graph the entire way down. It was so slick. I had a huge smile on my face that day.
That's very cool. So that goes above and beyond just what CloudWatch does, which effectively is just like whatever you're writing to the console.
Yeah, CloudWatch logging it's wanting. There's a lot that it doesn't do, in my opinion, very well. We will use it as an intermediate storage for some logging, and that's about it. We go to a tool like Datadog almost immediately with everything.
Yeah. That was a bad time for me to chuckle at your wanting comment as I was trying to swallow my drink.
No, when you said before about how you should have to parse through logs manually and dig through that's what I think of every time I go into CloudWatch. It's like this thing is just the worst.
That's what I do with CloudWatch, yeah. And all of my logging is just stuff that I'm just writing to the console. Like, I'm doing this thing now. Like, everything that you described as being terrible is yes, is what I wrote. So I'm actually taking notes here as well. Oh. You mentioned developer velocity. What has been your observation on the impact of that with observability?
When it's done properly, it shouldn't really have much, if anything, in your feature development of your work. The biggest problem is when you come about trying to train people on these things and convincing them that it's worth doing. So, for example, you may need to have custom spans in your APM to be able to track additional information like who the user was or a particular order that was being worked on during that function call. That additional training to understand how to use that API to record that information. Some people are okay with it. Some people go, what's the purpose of doing this? I've got logs. But in terms of what should be happening on a local system, I mean, when you're doing local development, it should be transparent enough, or hopefully you've got proper dependency injection frameworks in place to say, well, in local development, we don't care about turning these things on. We're not going to ship them to Datadog. You can take those options and save yourself some configuration and heartache for developers if need be. But generally, once it's in place and once you go out into a QA environment or any sort of production environment, experience has been pretty good with developers, and from what I've seen of hey, this problem is occurring, they can go take a look at that flame graph. They can go and take a look at spans, and they can look at those additional logs and go, oh, I know exactly why this failed, and now fixing it's going to be significantly easier.
Very cool.
So I guess my next question is, I think you've mentioned that there's some AI involved in this, right? So how has AI in observability changed the game, right, so to speak?
I am fairly reserved on AI, to be honest. I use it pretty much every day. I have GitHub Copilot, and when I'm writing code, I will often take advantage of its fancy autocomplete in writing some code here and there. But I don't like the current trend of these systems that go, oh, you can just natural language prompt your way into a full-blown application. I think those are pie in the sky dreams that I will never see in my lifetime actually work well. When it comes to the observability and stuff, I think this is probably a little too low level for a lot of just being able to say, oh, AI, go and take care of this for me. Now, it is really handy when you say things like, oh, I need a decorator for this Django code that logs everything that goes in and out. Well, you can go to something like ChatGPT or any of those other systems or Amazon Q or things and ask them for them. They're probably going to give you a fairly good one. But like a lot of things in AI, it works best when you know what it is that you want. You just don't want to have to type it yourself. And you can look at what AI generated and say whether that is correct or not. If you go to AI and you sit there and ask for one of these aspects or these decorators for logging and you don't know what it's supposed to be producing, you could be making something far worse than not having logging at all. You could do something that drastically reduces the performance of your system if you're not careful, or starts filling up log files on a hard drive, and all of a sudden you've got systems crashing left and right because it's ran out of disk space. So I'm very reserved on AI. You know, the other part of this talk tonight is talking about a product that I think has a lot of potential, but it's because it's incredibly focused on the AI and how to leverage it within system design.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, to your point about you not believing that you can kind of natural language prompt the AI into developing an application. I've found that I can get something close to the results that I want, but I have to be able to effectively tell it in pseudocode anyways, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like, I mean, all it's really doing is just kind of writing down my very detailed instructions, right? Yeah. You know, I haven't tried the, you know, make me a calculator or something like that, right? Like I've only tried like the very specific things, and even then, it is very hit and miss, and it doesn't usually stick to what it said the first time, right? Like, just kind of aims to please. And so even like trying to work with it almost like a pair, like a programmer pair, it's difficult because it's not super opinionated, and it's like, oh yeah, well we'll just do it this entirely different way. You know, it's very hit and miss. So what is this product that you were looking at?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think we've seen as a trend in AI products is, again, this idea that you can just naturally language your way into a full-blown website or application, whatever it may be. And as you said, you end up having to provide so much detail into it that you're probably almost better off just writing your specs, writing your details out yourself. And and again, I think there are some good places where AI can augment software development, but I don't think it can necessarily replace it in most situations. So this product that came about, it's been sort of in a bit of a quiet development for, I think, a little while now. Main guy behind it is a gentleman that I worked for years ago named Sam Hatum, and it's called Auto. And I've got a little screen share. I can just show you sort of the website as we kind of talk through it real quick. So it's on.auto. They picked an interesting URL for this one. I've never seen a website that was on.anything before. And the idea behind it is, let me zoom in here a little bit, see if we can make this picture a little bit bigger. The idea behind it is you still write your design specs. This takes a very domain-driven design approach. If you're familiar with event modeling, if you're familiar with those types of things, then this is going to feel like a fairly natural process for you, where you define actions, you define schemas, you define domain events, aggregates, these types of things. You spec this all out. So over here in this picture they have here on this demonstration, and I'll include a link, I'll send it to you and we can put it in some comments or something for the launch video they did last week. But they went through—
zoom in a little, please? Yeah. I'm sorry, Matthew.
Looks, okay. That's about as far as I think I can get it.
That's good.
Let me see okay. So you can do things like, this is the demonstration of a shopping cart. So the UI is to add an item to the shopping cart. And once that's added, it handles two domain events: a cart created, if you didn't already have one, and then an item added event. And this goes out into an event bus, into your event space, and can get processed from it. When you're defining all these specs, you can start doing your given, when, then type of spec building. If you've done a lot of test-driven development, you're probably familiar with that kind of setup where you say, well, given this scenario, when such and such happens, then this other thing should happen over here. So you write these things out. It is a very high-level, language-agnostic approach to building and designing your systems. And then when it's all done, you just hit a magic button and it goes off and it builds the underlying system to make this all work. But there are two things about this application in this system that really strike me as unique properties that will probably make this a success. One is that it doesn't rely on the AI to design the application. You still design it. You still define all of our traditional specs and traditional design processes. And again, if you're a fan of domain-driven design, this is all going to feel very familiar to you. But they also built in this process where you get hooks into the way that the AI generates the code so that you can do things like say, I want to log all inputs and outputs out of my function. It may not necessarily be part of the spec for every individual function, but here's an additional annotation that I can make on the system that defines how these things work inside and out. And I can say that, I want this KPI delivered into my metric system via this bit of code anytime this particular domain event occurs or this particular IO action occurs. So they kept things very, very focused, but still giving you the option to not only tweak the code after it's written, but to tweak the code as it's written. And that's one of the things that I found in a lot of these AI systems that has just absolutely driven me mad is this idea that I can prompt my way into an application. And when it's all done, that's the code. And if it's not right, then I have one of two options. I can either go back and reprompt and try to modify the prompt to get the way that I want, or I have to abandon that altogether and just modify, if the system allows it, the code that it generated. And neither of those are very good for long-term maintenance of a system. I won't name names because I feel like it would be a little rude to just throw these guys under the bus. But there was a system that I remember playing with last year where they said, AI prompt your way into this, into building an application that can do form inputs and write records to here and do this sort of stuff. So I sat there and I said, okay, this is all I want to do. I just want a basic form for creating users in this AWS account. And I provided some prompts and everything, and I hit go, and it spun for about 30 seconds and then just crashed. And it goes, sorry, we couldn't generate it. I'm like, okay. I tried it again, same problem. All right, it's a beta product, whatever. Let's see what it was able to generate, and let's just go ahead and modify it to make it work. Because if it got me 30, 40, 50% away, that's probably okay. I personally have no problem with the system that generates 30, 40, 50% of my code as long as I can do the other 50%, and it saves me some of those undifferentiated problems that I don't like solving, like how to center something in the middle of a web page.
Right.
But it didn't produce any code. And worse yet, there was no way to produce code in this system. You could only do it through AI prompting. And that was when I sort of realized this is not in a good place. Like these AI built products, they don't know what they don't know what works. And this is what we've been seeing for the last 2 years. It's just AI being thrown at everything, spaghetti on a wall, just to see what sticks. And this is a product, this on.auto, which I think has got a lot of potential because it still gives me the power to define everything in good design documents, good specs, things that mean a lot of good long-term longevity for any sort of system. But it takes away all of that boilerplate code that I don't really want to write. And if there is a case where I need to be able to control how that code is being generated or modifying it or annotating it in some way, I'm going to have the ability to do that. So this is one that I really, really want to get my hands on and start playing around with and hopefully generate some very interesting systems from it. And it's really a nice augmentation of a design platform. It's not supposed to be AI. In fact, when they originally talked about it last year, it was going under the name Narrative. The idea that we're going to build these narratives and a narrative-driven design for building these things. And it all used DDD and event modeling and all that behind the scenes, but they kind of coined this presentation layer as this narrative layer. And then last week they go, okay, a little bit of rebranding. Oh, and by the way, everything you just did in this narrative-driven design, we're just going to slap a little bit of augmentation of AI code on top of it. And now all of a sudden you don't have to worry about this two-step process of I'm going to spec everything and I put all my JSON schemas over here and I define what these example events are. And I do all this work. Now I got to do that really heavy lift of handing that to a developer and asking the developer to implement this correctly. Well, hit a button and you're probably going to be a good 80 or 90% of the way there. And whatever tweaks you need to make, you're going to be able to without foregoing AI in the future either.
Very cool. That's really interesting. I had not heard of that tool before, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it. Did you request access to it, I guess?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I did. I'm waiting with bated breath on when I can get my username and password into this thing.
Yeah.
And I haven't said that about any other AI tool. I mean, I love Copilot and its ability to just kind of fill in a little bit. And like I said, fancy auto-complete my code. I wouldn't give it up. Not to say like ChatGPT or Copilot's underlying GPT-3 or 2.5 or whatever it is great.
There's multiple models that you can use with GitHub now.
Yeah, whatever the default is, I think is what I'm still running with. That's fine. But it's because it's not designing systems for me. It's really just saving me a lot of typing that I don't want to have to do because I like really long variable names and I get really tired of really having to really type in those really long variable names over and over.
Yeah. Well, have you seen these new kind of AI code editors, which are honestly just using VS Code because it's open source, but somehow better integrating the AI with the ID? I don't know. So an example would be like Cursor or Windsurf. Have you messed around with those at all?
I haven't. I've been very close to Cursor to trying that one out, but I struggle because I've been using JetBrains products for 17 years now. Mm-hmm. When I first got into full-time development, I was doing all Visual Studio and I was introduced to ReSharper. And the way that I was trained as a developer was to leverage specific JetBrains functionality to speed up my development effort. So years ago, I tried VS Code and I hated it immediately. Not because VS Code is a bad editor. It's not. It's a great editor. It just doesn't have those workflows and those features in it that I've become so accustomed to out of JetBrains products. So I have a feeling that I probably would like Cursor if all I was doing was just typing out code. But as soon as I get into things like modifying existing code, refactoring it for readability, writing unit tests, anything like that where I'm using a lot of these keyboard shortcuts and snippet tools and things like that, I have a feeling I would just miss it too much and go right back to JetBrains.
Yeah. Yeah. I did not have that experience. The prior experience of working with an ID that I liked, right? So for what I use it for, VS Code is pretty darn wonderful. It does the job. So yeah, I'm sure if I use those other things, I'd like them too. I was actually checking out Windsurf last weekend, and that one is kind of an AI pair model, right? And I don't know if it was just late on a Friday for the AIs or something, but man, I was having a hard time getting it to actually implement the suggestions that I was asking for. It kept running into timeouts and stuff, which was fine because it didn't cost me tokens, but still, I was a little bit whelmed with my experience.
Yeah. And that's the other thing that terrifies me about a lot of these AI products is that they're building them based on usage. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad approach. Being someone who advises a lot of people for building stuff on AWS, having your revenue model not tied to your cost model can be a disaster for a long-term longevity of a company. So I understand that because the cost of running AI goes up, the more tokens you have, then you have to charge per token. But that also makes it a little terrifying and a little opaque when I'm sitting there and writing a bunch of code. I don't know if any of these tools have introduced any sort of like running counter that gives me a per second cost of using them, but until I see that, I don't know how much I trust it. Otherwise, I'll be sitting there plugging along, writing a bunch of code, be real happy with it, and then turn around and look and go like, I just spent $70 today. Like, that's not something I'm going to stick with.
Yeah. So what I saw with Windsurf is they have kind of a default model that doesn't count against your token, the amount of tokens that you got, right? And then you can go with like higher end models. Like, there was a model that was charging like a token and a quarter to use, right? So it's kind of an interesting balance of trying to get in with the latest models versus something that might be a little bit less cool, but still very functional, right? So overall, I think this is kind of an exciting time to be in the software business. But I absolutely do not believe that AI is going to replace humans that understand these things, right? My opinion is that AI doesn't understand the consequences of its suggestions, right? And so that's why it's like, sure, you can microwave forks, that's fine, You can microwave a fork, absolutely.
Yeah. A Reddit post said that you can do it, so now everyone's doing it.
Yeah, it is possible to do. Yes, it's not advised.
Oh. And unfortunately, that I think is also the only exciting thing that's really happening in this industry right now. I mean, I've been burnt out on web development now for years. I did it for years and I really, really enjoyed it. But it feels like we really haven't progressed much on the web development side of the world for 8 or 10 years now. Like I sit down to write an application, I sit down to write a website or something, and it's the exact same thing I would have written 10 years ago. And it's just not that much fun. So I think that's one of the reasons why everyone's really gravitating towards this AI stuff, is because it's actually some really interesting things are happening. And I'm looking forward to the organization or the product that really figures out this great fit. And this Windsurf definitely looks interesting. Cursor, I think, has been very interesting. Again, they feel a little too focused on AI doing the work. But if there's that happy medium that someone figures out, I'll probably be using it.
Yeah. Yeah, the promise of kind of having an agentic AI that actually remembers the context and the decisions that were made previously, I think that's very powerful, right? Because, your average chat model doesn't remember what it said previously, there might be a little bit of it, but yeah, it's still it's like talking to someone with short-term memory loss. Like they just, sorry, what'd you say? So we're getting up to the top of our hour here.
Yes.
Were there any questions from the audience, Roger, that you've seen?
Nothing so far. Nope.
Okay.
I do see someone talking about chatting up Emacs.
Yes.
Yeah, that was me. So
Yes.
Sean, one of the other hosts, if you mention anything about VS Code, the first thing he says is Emacs. Emacs is the best. Forget about VS Code. Emacs is the best. And
Emacs is better.
Yeah.
According to
And
John.
he did show me some really cool stuff with it the other day, and but I'm just so used to VS Code at this point. I want to stick to the one IDE thing and develop that as opposed to jumping into something new. But you never know. He might sell me on it another time. Maybe when the AI gets better.
Something new is Emacs. Is that what you just said?
Yeah. No. If the AI gets better in Emacs, maybe I'll try it then. Right. So
Yeah.
All right.
Once AI gets to the point where I can take a code block and I can say refactor this into a separate method and it does it properly, because again, that's one of those workflows I have in JetBrains that I couldn't live without. Yeah. Once AI can do that, then I'm gonna probably go IDE hopping and find that good one. Once I can
Nice.
take a code block and be like, okay, save a reference, instead of this being an anonymous class, I want you to save a reference to this as a variable so I can use it again later. Once it does that, I'm gonna be IDE hopping. I'm gonna go try Cursor. I'll try Windsurf, things like that. I haven't heard of any AIs able to do that yet, though.
Yeah. So a little bit of Emacs trivia. According to Wikipedia, they started development on that in the 70s, and in the GNU version was being worked on in 1984 by Richard Stallman.
Oh, good old Stallman.
Yeah.
Can't go wrong with the Stallman product.
No.
I've also heard, NeoVim is getting a resurgence. A coworker of mine, he sat down a while back and he's like, okay, I'm going to go hard into NeoVim. I'm going to write all these Lua scripts. I'm going to do all these shortcuts. I've been watching a lot of like Theo and Primeagen lately. And, as they love showing off, especially Prime, talking about like all these NeoVim shortcuts and stuff that he has. And I'm like, that looks great. I just would rather do other things than sitting there and customizing my IDE for hours on end.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. I don't understand the point of it.
Once you get there, it's wonderful. I've got a laptop back here on my desk that I think I started using as my personal back in like 18 or 19 or something like that. And it's Linux. And I spent like 6 months getting this thing with every keyboard shortcut, everything exactly right. But it's the 6-year-old distro, and I forgot to get them upgraded in time. So now it's like, it's dated, it's old, and it's like, but I'm not going to go spend that 6 months getting a laptop working exactly right again. So I just have to suffer through old patches and things on the thing. But I'm not young anymore. I don't care about like wasting 6 months of my time making something perfect. I just kind of want to produce.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm not that particular about laptops, actually. I'll just use whatever. Maybe I'm the weird one here.
No, I think that makes total sense. It
Yeah.
should just do what it needs to do.
Yeah. I jump between Windows and Mac and Linux pretty regularly, and yeah, they all have their purposes. So,
You kind of lost me at Windows.
it has its purpose, man. It has its purpose. So yeah, I think we're about done. Any last things you'd like to plug before we go, Mr. Matthew?
Oh boy. If you are interested in the AWS CDK, if you want to learn more about it, if you want to become an expert in it, I do have a course. If you go to my website, MatthewBonig.com, there is a big banner at the top of it that'll take you to my advanced CDK course. There is, of course, the CDKbook.com. If you'd rather read rather than watch some video content, that's also another way of getting some. And otherwise, they'll just be me at reInvent this year and probably talking about AWS along the way.
Cool. I will make sure to include those things in the show notes. Yes, Roger, what were you going to say?
Matthew, do you have any plans to write another book?
I've thought about it a couple of different times. Thankfully, because it was 4 of us who wrote the CDK book, I only had to write a quarter of it, and it wasn't too bad. But even that quarter sucked a lot of life out of me. So if I was going to write a book, it would probably be a fairly short one. I'm kind of illiterate anyway. But is there a topic that you were thinking of? You said that like you were leading into a particular topic.
Maybe we could do a collaboration, huh? Yeah,
There you go. There's been a couple of products that I've been thinking about. There's a product out there called Wing that is actually created by the guy who originally built the CDK for AWS that was aimed at being a cloud agnostic, cloud first development language. So you would write all of your application code and all of your infrastructure in the Wing language. And then you would just say, okay, now go deploy this to AWS or go deploy it to Azure or whatever it may be. Was thinking about writing a book on that. at one point. There's also a new product out there that's coming around from the guy who did Chef and Ansible called System Initiative. I think it's got a lot of really interesting potentials when it comes to platform engineering. So I hope to spend some time on that this year, seeing if it's a good fit for platform engineers and sort of what we do a little bit here at Defiance Digital. And like I said, this auto, I'm really curious about seeing where that goes here in the next few months. And I really want to get back into more hardcore software development rather than just DevOps type work that I've been doing.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome.
I've known a lot of folks that have written tech books, and not a single one of them has ever said it was worth their time in terms of money or an easy process. So
Yeah, we wrote it because we kept getting asked to write it. And I think for a lot of us, it was more of the, hey, come talk to us. We wrote a book on it. So it was more of like, hey, this could lead into other opportunities rather than direct revenue off the book itself. Because, you're not going to get rich writing a tech book.
Yeah. It's something you do because you're passionate about it, not because
Exactly.
you're in it for the money. So.
Yep.
All righty. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a great talk. I appreciate everyone's time here. Any last thoughts, Roger?
Nope, nothing.
Okay,
we're good.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, y'all. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.